Hey, tonight we are going to explore the forgotten world of medieval roof thatchers, those silent artisans whose hands spoke the language of straw and reed. Their story unfolds beneath ancient skies, where villages nestled in valleys watched, as these craftsmen ascended to the heavens one handful of golden straw at a time. These were not mere labourers, but keepers of an ancient wisdom, guardians of warmth and shelter in a world of bitter winds and driving rain. Their calloused fingers knew the secrets of creating sanctuaries that would stand against the howling elements, sheltering generations who slept peacefully beneath roofs woven from the harvest's bounty, a forgotten lullaby of craft and care that spans centuries of whispered tradition. If you're enjoying this gentle descent into medieval craftsmanship, please consider liking this story, sharing it with someone who appreciates the quieter rhythms of history, or subscribing so you never miss another historical journey. Where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps an old house with its own stories settled into its beams. Now dim your lights, settle into a comfortable position, and let the rustling of ancient thatch in the medieval wind carry you into a world where time moves to the rhythm of patient hands and weathered wisdom. In the soft grey light of a medieval dawn, when dew still clung to the meadow grasses and birds had just begun their morning songs, Thomas the Thatcher rose from his humble straw mattress. The year was 1348, and the small village of Willowbrook in the English countryside was still shrouded in the gentle mist that rolled off the nearby river. Thomas moved quietly, careful not to wake his wife Eleanor, who slumbered peacefully beneath their woolen blanket. Their one-room cottage was modest but warm, protected from the elements by the very craft Thomas had dedicated his life to, a perfectly thatched roof of golden straw that arched above them like a protective hand. Thomas was a man of medium height, with shoulders broadened by years of labour and hands that told the story of his craft. Calloused, strong, and possessing a dexterity that belied their weathered appearance. His beard, once the colour of the wheat he worked with, was now streaked with silver, marking the passage of his 45 winters. Moving to the small hearth, he quietly stoked the embers from the previous night's fire, coaxing them back to life with practiced patience. The soft orange glow illuminated his face, creating shadows that danced across the earthen walls of their home. Outside, Willowbrook was beginning to stir. The village consisted of perhaps 30 homes clustered around, a small stone church with fields stretching outward in a patchwork of greens and browns. Most of the dwellings were similar to Thomas's, timber-framed structures with wattle and daubed walls. What distinguished each home, what gave it character and protection from the temperamental English weather, was its roof. And in Willowbrook, many of these roofs bore the distinctive mark of Thomas's craftsmanship. Thomas broke his fast with a simple meal of dark bread, a small cup of ale, and a piece of hard cheese. As he ate by the growing warmth of the fire, he mentally prepared for the day ahead. The home of William the Miller needed attention, its eastern roof face showing signs of wear after 15 seasons of sun, rain, and occasional snow. William had approached Thomas after Sunday Mass, speaking in hushed tones about the small leak that had appeared during the last heavy rainfall. Such was how Thomas often received his commissions, not through formal arrangements, but through quiet conversations between neighbours, the exchange of concerned words about shelter and protection. Eleanor stirred as Thomas gathered his tools into a worn leather satchel that had once belonged to his father, also a thatcher. "Will you be at the miller's all day?" she asked, her voice still soft with sleep. Thomas nodded, explaining that he needed to assess the damage and determine how much new material would be required. "I'll bring some bread and cheese for midday," Eleanor offered, already thinking ahead to her own tasks, tending their small vegetable garden, gathering eggs from their few chickens, and perhaps visiting the stream to wash their clothing if I... The day grew warm enough. With a gentle parting touch to his wife's hand, Thomas stepped out into the brightening day. The village path was still soft beneath his feet, dampened by the night's moisture. He carried not only his tools, but also his leggings, leather protectors he would strap to his legs before climbing onto William's roof. Years of experience had taught him the importance of protection. The scratch of straw against bare skin could leave marks that would sting for days. As he walked through the awakening village, he exchanged nods with early risers. Adam the blacksmith already at his forge, the warm glow visible through the open door. Sarah the baker's wife, preparing the day's dough in the communal oven house, and Father Michael, the village priest, sweeping the stone steps of the church. These silent acknowledgements formed the fabric of village life, as intricate and interconnected as the thatch Thomas wove. William's home sat near the river, close to the watermill that provided his livelihood and the village with flour. The structure was larger than most, reflecting the miller's relatively prosperous position within the community. Thomas found the miller already outside, anxiously inspecting the problematic roof. "There, Thomas," William pointed to a darkened patch near the chimney. "When the rain comes hard from the east, water finds its way inside. My wife has placed a bucket, but I fear for the timbers if it worsens." His voice carried the universal concern of homeowners throughout time, the fear of water's patient destruction. Thomas studied the roof with eyes trained by decades of experience. He could see the issue immediately. Years of smoke from the chimney had degraded the thatch in that area, and recent winds had loosened the bindings. "I'll need to remove the damaged section," he explained in his measured way. "The underlay is likely sound, but we'll need fresh straw for the visible layer and perhaps some new spars to secure it." The two men discussed materials and timing, eventually settling on an arrangement that would see Thomas working on the roof for the next 3 days. As was common in their barter economy, payment would come in the form of flour from William's mill, enough to last Eleanor's baking needs for 2 months, plus a small silver coin, a rare and valuable addition that reflected both the miller's means and the essential nature of Thomas's craft. With terms agreed upon, Thomas set about his preparation. From his satchel, he produced his most treasured possession, his father's thatching tools, passed down when the older man's hands became too knotted with age to continue the craft. There was a hammer made by the village blacksmith's grandfather, wooden pushes with smooth handles worn to the shape of Thomas's grip, an iron-tipped rake called a thistle for combing thatch, several long needles, and his prideful possession, a ledget, a flat wooden tool used for dressing and positioning the straw. Each item had been cared for meticulously, oiled and maintained with the reverence due to implements that stood between a community and the harshness of nature. Before ascending to the roof, Thomas took time to inspect the straw William had procured. Proper materials were essential to quality thatching. The best straw came from wheat or rye that had been harvested with care, using a scythe rather than a sickle to ensure the stalks remained long and unbroken. After harvest, it needed to be properly dried and stored, protected from moisture that would cause decay. Thomas ran the golden stems through his fingers, bending them to test resilience, checking for signs of mold or weakness. This batch was good, locally grown and well preserved, with the strength and flexibility necessary for a roof that might need to last 20 years or more. With William's son assisting, Thomas set up his ladder against the side of the house. Before climbing, he strapped on his leggings and donned a wide-brimmed hat woven from the same straw he worked with, protection against both scrapes and sun. The ascent was familiar, a climb he had made thousands of times throughout his life, yet he never took it lightly. A thatcher's greatest occupational hazard was falling, and Thomas had known craftsmen who had broken limbs or worse from such accidents. Upon reaching the roof, Thomas moved carefully across its surface. A well-constructed thatch created a solid platform, but one had to understand how to distribute weight and where to place one's feet. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed like Thomas was walking on a precarious surface of loose straw, but there was science and structure beneath his steps. Layers of material compressed and secured to wooden battens that ran horizontally across the roof's rafters. The damaged area became more apparent upon closer inspection. Thomas knelt and gently pulled at the surface layer, revealing dampness beneath. "Hand me the rake," he called down to William's son, who quickly passed up the thistle. With careful movements, Thomas began to comb back the deteriorated thatch, gradually exposing the extent of the problem. He worked methodically, removing only what was necessary, preserving what remained sound. As the morning sun rose higher, casting shorter shadows across the village, Thomas settled into the rhythm of his work. There was a meditative quality to thatching that few outside the craft could appreciate. Each handful of straw needed to be aligned, the butt ends facing outward, the stems overlapping in a precise pattern that would shed water effectively. The thickness had to be consistent, the gradient of the roof maintained to the proper angle for water runoff. William's wife appeared below, offering a cup of watered ale to quench Thomas's thirst. He paused briefly to drink, wiping his brow and surveying the village from his elevated position. From here, he could see most of Willowbrook, the fields where peasants were beginning to work, the forest edge where woodcutters ventured for fuel, and the winding path that connected them to the larger world beyond. The perspective was one that few in the village regularly experienced, a momentary elevation that separated Thomas from the earthbound concerns below. Returning to his task, Thomas began laying the new thatch. First came the underlayer, secured to the battens with spars, split hazel wood pieces shaped like elongated hairpins that anchored the straw to the roof structure. He twisted and positioned these with practiced precision, driving them deep into the existing thatch. Each movement is economical, honed by years of repetition. By midday, Eleanor arrived with Thomas's promised meal. She exchanged pleasantries with the miller's family, while Thomas descended briefly to eat. They sat together in the shade of an ancient oak that grew near the mill, sharing quiet conversation about village matters. Who was expecting a child, whose cow had gone dry, the priest's plans for the upcoming feast day. These moments of connection, punctuated the solitary nature of Thomas's work, reminding him of his place in the community's intricate web. Walter the carpenter asked if you might look at his mother's cottage when you finish here, Eleanor mentioned between bites of bread. The winter storms loosened some thatch above her sleeping area. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Walter's mother was a widow of advanced years with little to trade, but Thomas would never allow an elder to sleep beneath a leaking roof. Some work was done for proper payment, and some was done because it was right. Every Thatcher understood this unspoken obligation to community welfare. After their brief repast, Thomas returned to the roof while Eleanor gathered her basket and continued her rounds in the village. The afternoon stretched before him, hours of methodical labor as he laid course after course of fresh straw. To maintain the proper thickness and ensure longevity, each layer needed to be combed and dressed with the legate, a rhythmic patting that aligned and compacted the material into a water-resistant barrier. As he worked, Thomas occasionally sang, softly to himself, old songs with lyrics partly forgotten, melodies passed down through generations of craftsmen. These weren't the boisterous tunes one might hear in the village tavern, but working songs with rhythms that matched the pace of his hands, keeping time as he moved across the roof's expanse. The melodies drifted down to those passing below, a gentle reminder of the work progressing above. The repair area gradually transformed under his attention. What had been a water-darkened depression became a fresh golden patch, seamlessly blending with the surrounding roof. Thomas took particular care with the junction where thatch met chimney, creating a weather-tight seal that would resist the driving rains that came from the east. This was specialized knowledge, understanding how different parts of a building interacted, how smoke and heat affected straw over time, how to reinforce areas subject to unusual stress. As afternoon waned toward evening, Thomas secured the final layer with a decorative pattern, a simple herringbone design that was both functional and aesthetic, helping to lock the surface fibers in place while providing his signature touch. Some thatchers created elaborate patterns or even figures in their work, but Thomas preferred restraint, believing that the beauty of thatch lay in its understated functionality rather than ostentatious display. William climbed partway up the ladder to inspect the work, nodding with approval at what he saw. "Will it need another day's attention?" he asked, calculating the disruption to his household. Thomas shook his head, explaining that while he would return tomorrow to dress the surrounding areas and ensure proper drainage, the critical repair was complete. The miller's relief was evident. A secure roof meant security for his family and the precious flower stocks stored within. As the sun began its descent, casting long golden rays across the thatched rooftops of Willowbrook, Thomas gathered his tools and carefully descended. His back ached with the familiar pain of a day spent in labor, but it was a satisfying discomfort, the physical reminder of a job well done. William offered him a cup of fresh milk from his cow, a luxury Thomas accepted gratefully, the cool, liquid soothing his throat after hours of breathing straw dust. The walk home through the village took on a different character in the evening light. Cooking fires sent tendrils of smoke through the thatched roofs he and his predecessors had created, the smell of pottage and baking bread filling the air. Children who had spent the day helping in fields or learning trades played quieter games. As daylight faded, their voices carrying across the village green. Several called greetings to Master Thomas, showing the respect accorded to an essential craftsman. Eleanor had prepared a simple supper, vegetables from their garden stewed, with a small piece of salt pork, barley bread still warm from the communal oven, and a precious half-cup of wine saved from the Christmas service. As they ate by candlelight, Thomas described the day's work while Eleanor shared village news gathered during her errands. This quiet exchange was the cornerstone of their partnership, a daily ritual that connected them to each other and to the community they served. After the meal, as darkness settled fully over the medieval landscape, Thomas stepped outside once more. Looking up at the night sky, he could see stars emerging between scattered clouds. The moon, nearly full, cast enough light to illuminate the outlines of the village homes, each crowned with thatch that glowed silver in the moonlight. His eyes traced the distinctive slopes and contours of roofs he had created or maintained over decades, experiencing a quiet pride in this lasting contribution to his world. The following morning arrived with a gentle rainfall, not the driving storm that had revealed the leak in William's roof, but a soft patter that tested Thomas's repair. Rising earlier than usual, he made his way to the miller's home through the drizzle, his woolen cloak beaded with moisture. William greeted him with good news. The roof had held perfectly, not a drop finding its way inside. Thomas nodded, unsurprised, but pleased, and proceeded to complete the final dressing of the thatch, despite the damp conditions. Word of the successful repair spread quickly, as news always did in small communities. By midday, Thomas had received 2 more requests, one from Walter regarding his mother's cottage as Eleanor had mentioned, and another from the alewife, whose brewing shed needed attention before the coming harvest festivities. Such was the nature of a Thatcher's life, periods of steady work punctuated by urgent repairs, all governed by the rhythms of weather and seasons. The following week saw Thomas moving from one project to another within Willowbrook, and occasionally travelling to neighbouring hamlets where no resident thatcher practiced. These journeys beyond his immediate community were always illuminating, providing opportunities to observe regional variations in technique and material. In the marshy areas to the east, thatchers used reeds rather than straw, creating roofs of remarkable durability. To the north, where stronger winds prevailed, different binding methods were employed. Thomas absorbed these observations, occasionally adapting his own practice when he encountered superior methods. During one such journey to a distant farmstead, Thomas encountered a young man named Robert, who watched his work with unusual interest. Unlike most onlookers who quickly grew bored with the methodical pace of thatching, Robert remained day after day, asking thoughtful questions about technique and materials. By the 3rd day, Thomas invited the youth to hand him tools, testing his attention to detail and willingness to learn. "Have you considered taking an apprentice?" Robert finally asked on the 4th day, his intention clear. Thomas worked in silence for several moments, contemplating the question's implications. He had never formally trained anyone, partly due to the economic challenges of supporting an additional person, partly due to never finding someone with sufficient interest and aptitude. "It's not an easy life," Thomas eventually replied, gesturing toward his weathered hands. "The winters are hard, with little work but much need. The summers are endless labor from dawn to dusk. Your hands will bleed before they callous. Your back will ache before it strengthens. He paused, studying the young man's reaction. And few recognize the skill involved. They see only straw and not the centuries of knowledge in its arrangement. Robert remained undeterred, explaining that he was the third son of a farmer with insufficient land to divide among his children. He would inherit nothing, but needed a craft to sustain himself. Moreover, he had always been drawn to creating things that lasted, that provided fundamental human needs. A well-thatched roof, he observed, is the difference between comfort and misery, between health and illness. What greater purpose might a craftsman serve? Impressed by this understanding, Thomas agreed to consider the apprenticeship, arranging for Robert to visit Willowbrook after the harvest season to discuss terms. The encounter left Thomas reflective as he journeyed home, contemplating his own mortality and the continuity of his craft. Every thatcher understood that they were links in a chain stretching back to time immemorial. Humans had been covering shelters with plant materials since they first sought protection from the elements. The techniques evolved slowly. Knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. Upon returning to Willowbrook, Thomas found himself viewing his village with fresh eyes, seeing not just the current state of its roofs, but their history and future. Some cottages still bore the underlying work of his father, visible only to his trained eye in the particular way certain ridges were formed or valleys structured. His own work would similarly persist beyond his lifetime, perhaps to be maintained, someday by Robert or another apprentice yet unmet. This sense of continuity brought both comfort and responsibility. During Sunday services in the small stone church, Thomas found himself studying its roof with professional interest. The church, unlike the humble cottages, was covered with wooden shingles rather than thatch, a more expensive but longer-lasting solution for an important community building. Yet even this alternative roofing required expert installation and regular maintenance. Father Michael had mentioned concerning leaks during heavy rains, and Thomas made a mental note to offer his assistance. Though not his primary material, his understanding of water flow and roof dynamics would prove useful. As summer progressed toward autumn, Thomas's days followed their seasonal pattern. Early mornings were spent collecting and preparing materials, sorting straw for quality, bundling it for efficient use, occasionally harvesting reeds from the riverbank for specialized applications. Mid-mornings through late afternoons were dedicated to installation and repairs, with the longest days reserved for the most extensive projects. Evenings were for tool maintenance, knowledge sharing with interested villagers, and the occasional creation of smaller thatched items, decorative elements for harvest celebrations, or practical objects like beehives crafted from the same materials that protected their homes. The changing season brought new challenges and opportunities. Harvest time meant fresh straw would soon be available in abundance, but it also meant competition for labor as all hands were needed in the fields. Thomas adjusted his schedule accordingly, postponing non-urgent repairs and focusing on preparing for winter's demands. He knew from experience that the transition from autumn to winter often revealed weaknesses in roofs that had seemed sound during drier months. During this busy period, Thomas received word that Robert would indeed come to Willowbrook after the harvest to begin his apprenticeship. This news prompted discussions with Eleanor about practical arrangements, where the young man would sleep, how they would feed an additional person through winter, what modest payment could be offered alongside the valuable training. Their cottage was small, but they determined that a sleeping area could be arranged near the hearth, with a straw mattress similar to their own. As for payment, the arrangement would follow tradition. Room and board provided in exchange for labor, with a small stipend given only after basic competency was achieved, usually after the first full year. This impending change to their household led Thomas to reflect on his own apprenticeship long ago. He had trained under his father primarily, but also spent 2 valuable seasons with a master thatcher from a distant town who had introduced techniques unknown in Willowbrook at that time. The memories were vivid, his youthful impatience tempered by his father's insistence on methodical perfection, the painful blisters that formed and reformed until his hands toughened, the gradual transition from merely following instructions to understanding the principles behind them. Thomas resolved to be a thorough but kind master to Robert, remembering both the effective and ineffective aspects of his own training. The craft was demanding enough without unnecessary harshness. What mattered was developing the young man's eye for quality and his understanding of the materials, how straw behaved when wet or dry, how it aged over decades, how it interacted with the wooden structure beneath and the elements above. As he made these plans for knowledge transmission, Thomas continued his daily work. Late summer brought the repair of Walter's mother's cottage, a relatively simple task that Thomas insisted on doing without payment, knowing the elderly woman had little to spare. He did accept her offering of freshly gathered mushrooms from the forest edge, which Eleanor transformed into a savory addition to their evening stew. Such exchanges characterized the village economy, direct, personal, based on relationships rather than strict calculations of value. On a particularly warm afternoon, as Thomas worked on the old woman's roof, he noticed unusual activity in the village centre. A small group of travellers had arrived, a rare occurrence in Willowbrook, which lay well off the main roads connecting larger towns. Setting aside his tools, Thomas descended to investigate, joining other curious villagers gathering around the newcomers. The travellers proved to be a merchant and his small retinue, forced to detour from their planned route due to flooding on the main road. As they rested their horses and sought refreshment, the merchant engaged the villagers in conversation, sharing news from distant places, political developments in London, unusual weather in northern counties, rumours of strange illness in port cities far away. The latter information caused discomfort among the listeners. Disease was a constant fear in medieval communities where medicine remained primarily herbal, and illness often meant death. Thomas listened attentively, but with the measured caution of a man whose life had been bounded by a small geographical area. Grand events in London or beyond had little direct impact on daily life in Willowbrook, yet the mention of spreading illness gave him pause. He had lived long enough to remember previous outbreaks that had claimed neighbours and loved ones. With a silent prayer that such suffering would pass them by, he returned to his work, finding solace in the familiar movements of his craft. The following weeks brought the full intensity of harvest, with every able-bodied villager participating, In the collection of crops that would sustain them through the coming winter, Thomas divided his time between helping with the harvest, his contribution to the community effort, and urgent roofing repairs that couldn't wait. The shortening days meant working from first light until his hands could no longer see their tasks, sometimes continuing by torch or lantern light when circumstances demanded. As the harvest concluded and the first autumn chill settled over Willowbrook, Robert arrived as promised. The young man appeared at Thomas's door one crisp morning, possessing nothing but a small bundle of clothes, a wooden spoon carved by his own hand, and an eager determination that reminded Thomas of himself in younger days. Eleanor welcomed him, warmly, showing him where he would sleep near the hearth, the warmest spot in their humble home, and an honored position for a newcomer. The apprenticeship began immediately, with Thomas first assessing what Robert already knew about tools and materials. The young man had basic knowledge of farm implements, but had never handled specialized thatching tools. Thomas started with the fundamentals: how to examine straw for quality, how to bundle it efficiently, how to maintain the precious tools that would become extensions of the craftsman's hands. These early lessons took place in the small yard behind Thomas's cottage, where bundles of straw were stored under a simple lean-to roof that protected them from rainfall. The craft begins before you ever touch a roof, Thomas explained, demonstrating how to align the straw so that all stems face the same direction. Preparation determines outcome. A thatcher who rushes to the roof with poorly sorted materials creates future leaks with every handful. Robert nodded earnestly, his hands mimicking Thomas's movements as they created neat bundles secured with simple twine. The first weeks of the apprenticeship focused on these preparatory skills and basic maintenance tasks, assisting Thomas with repairs rather than attempting installation. Robert proved an apt pupil, watching carefully and asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated his grasp of underlying principles rather than mere techniques. In the evenings, by the light of tallow, candles, and the hearth's glow, Thomas would explain the history of thatching traditions, how techniques had evolved over centuries, and how regional variations reflected local materials and weather conditions. Eleanor observed this knowledge transfer with approval, recognizing the importance of what was occurring. Though she had never worked as a thatcher, decades of marriage to Thomas had given her considerable understanding of the craft's principles. Occasionally, she would interject with practical insights, how to identify approaching weather that might interrupt work, which villagers maintained their roofs conscientiously and which required more frequent intervention, or stories about particularly challenging projects Thomas had undertaken in years past. As autumn deepened toward winter, the nature of Thomas's work shifted to reflect seasonal demands. Fewer new projects commenced as cold weather approached, but emergency repairs became more urgent. A leaking roof that might be a mere inconvenience in summer became life-threatening when freezing temperatures arrived. These urgent calls gave Robert his first experiences with the less ideal working conditions thatchers often faced, making repairs during light snowfall with numbed fingers and visible breath, racing against approaching storms. During one such repair at the home of the village smith, Thomas allowed Robert to complete a small section independently while he observed. The young man worked methodically despite the cold, his movements becoming more confident with each bundle of straw he positioned. When the section was complete, Thomas inspected it thoroughly, noting both its strengths and areas for improvement. "You've created a sound barrier that will keep water out," he acknowledged. "But see how the pattern doesn't quite match the surrounding thatch? In time, this section will weather differently, becoming visible as a distinct patch." He demonstrated how to blend new work with old, creating a seamless transition that would be undetectable after a few seasons of sun and rain had unified the colors. Robert absorbed these lessons eagerly, his respect for the craft deepening as he recognized the subtleties involved. What had once seemed simple, covering a roof with straw, revealed itself as a complex integration of material science, weather understanding, structural knowledge, and aesthetic consideration. Each decision a thatcher made affected the durability, functionality, and appearance of the final roof. As winter took full hold of Willowbrook, work necessarily slowed. The coldest days were spent indoors, repairing tools, preparing materials for future use, and continuing Robert's theoretical education. Thomas showed him how to create scale models of roof sections using small sticks and straw, demonstrating different techniques without the challenges of weather and height. These miniature creations allowed Robert to experiment and make mistakes on a small scale, learning through trial and error in ways that wouldn't be possible on actual buildings. The winter evenings grew long, filled with storytelling around the hearth as neighbors occasionally gathered in each other's homes to conserve fuel and share community. During these gatherings, Thomas observed how Robert integrated into village society, building relationships that would eventually translate into work opportunities. A thatcher's reputation was built not only on technical skill, but on trustworthiness, reliability, and connection to the community they served. One particularly cold night, as snow accumulated outside and the wind found every tiny gap in the cottage walls, the conversation turned to signs and portents. The smith's wife, known for her interest in folk wisdom, mentioned troubling dreams she'd been having, visions of empty villages and silent churches. Others admitted to feeling unusual foreboding, attributing it to the harsh winter or recent reports of illness in a town several days' journey away. Thomas remained quiet during this discussion, neither dismissing these concerns nor feeding them. His was a practical mind focused on tangible problems with concrete solutions. Yet even he could not deny the unusual nature of recent events. Birds migrating at strange times, livestock behaving erratically, the persistent rumors of spreading sickness. The medieval mind inhabited a world where natural phenomena carried deeper meanings, where physical events might signal divine messages. Thomas balanced this cultural understanding with his craftsman's pragmatism, focusing on what he could control, the integrity of the roofs that protected his community. As winter gradually loosened its grip and the first tentative signs of spring appeared, Thomas and Robert resumed more active work. The freeze-thaw cycles of late winter and early spring were particularly damaging to thatched roofs, creating urgent need for repairs across Willowbrook. These busy days provided Robert with accelerated practical experience, his hands growing, more confident, and his eye more discerning. On a mild day in early spring, as they worked together on the roof of the parish granary, Thomas noticed a distant figure on the road leading to the village, a solitary traveller moving with apparent difficulty. Something in the traveller's gait suggested illness or injury. Thomas and Robert descended from their work to join others gathering as the stranger approached. The traveller proved to be a young monk from a monastery 2 days' journey away, bringing grim news. The illness that had been rumoured for months had become reality, spreading through nearby communities with devastating effect. His own monastery had already lost several brothers to the disease, which struck without warning and often killed within days. Father Michael led the exhausted monk to the church while the villagers dispersed in somber groups, discussing the implications of this news. Thomas and Robert returned to their work in subdued silence, the rhythm of their thatching taking on an almost meditative quality as they each processed the troubling information. That evening, a village council was hastily convened in the church, with all households represented. The decision was made to limit contact with outside communities as much as possible, postponing the spring market that usually brought traders from surrounding areas and sending only a small group of men to the nearest town for essential supplies that couldn't be produced locally. Thomas found himself appointed to this group due to his level-headed nature and knowledge of the wider region from his occasional thatching work beyond Willowbrook. The expedition to town was planned for the following week, allowing time for Thomas to complete critical repairs and prepare Robert to continue work during his absence. The young apprentice had progressed remarkably in the months since his arrival, developing skills that would normally take years to acquire. Thomas attributed this partly to Robert's natural aptitude, but also to the intensive nature of their working relationship. Living and working together daily created opportunities for continuous learning that a more conventional apprenticeship might not provide. "While I'm gone," Thomas instructed, "focus on maintenance rather than new installations. Widow Marjorie's cottage needs attention near the chimney, and the cooper has mentioned some dampness in his western wall that may indicate a roof problem." He detailed specific techniques Robert should employ, materials to use, and how to handle payment or barter for these services. Eleanor prepared provisions for Thomas's journey: hard bread, dried meat, and a small flask of ale. As a precaution against the rumoured illness, she also included a pouch of dried herbs believed to purify air and prevent contagion. Though Thomas privately doubted their efficacy, he accepted them gratefully, recognizing the comfort their presence provided his wife. The small delegation departed Willowbrook at dawn, 4 men walking with determined purpose toward the town of Fairfield, where they would purchase salt, metal goods, and other necessities. The journey was largely silent, each man absorbed in his thoughts and the unusual circumstances of their mission. They passed through 2 smaller villages en route, noting with discomfort the unusual quietness of both. Fewer people visible, doors closed despite the pleasant weather, smoke rising from fewer chimneys than expected. At Fairfield, their concerns deepened. The normally bustling market square was sparsely populated, many stalls empty or abandoned. Those merchants who remained kept their distance from customers, placing goods at arm's length before retreating to receive payment. The delegation completed their purchases as quickly as possible, declining offers of lodging for the night in favor of beginning their return journey immediately. As they departed Fairfield, they encountered a cart bearing 3 shrouded forms, undeniable evidence of the illness's presence. The cart driver, his face half covered with a cloth, warned them to avoid the eastern road where an entire family had succumbed. With this grim advice, the Willowbrook men altered their route, taking a longer path home through denser forest, away from settlements. Thomas returned to Willowbrook with mixed emotions. Relief at completing the necessary trading mission, but deep concern about what he had witnessed. The village council gathered immediately to hear the delegation's report. They described the conditions in Fairfield and the smaller communities they had passed, the visible evidence of illness and the atmosphere of fear that permeated the region. Based on this information, further restrictions were implemented. The village effectively closed itself off, with watches established to intercept travelers and direct them around rather than through the community. All but the most essential work in the fields continued, however, as the planting season could not be delayed without risking future hunger. During this unsettling period, Thomas found solace in his craft, the physical labor of thatching, the familiar materials in his hands, and the visible progress of each project provided stability amid uncertainty. Robert continued to assist and learn, though both men now worked with an underlying awareness of the fragility of the world around them. The roofs they maintained and created took on added significance, not just protection from rain and snow, but symbols of continuity and resilience in troubled times. Several tense weeks passed with Willowbrook remaining mercifully untouched by the spreading illness. Spring advanced into early summer, crops grew in the fields, and a cautious optimism began to emerge. Thomas and Robert resumed a more normal work pattern, including a significant new project: rethatching the roof of the alehouse in preparation for the midsummer celebrations that were tentatively being planned as a morale-boosting event. Working side by side on this larger project, Thomas found himself increasingly treating Robert as a partner rather than an apprentice. The young man's skills had developed remarkably, and he now anticipated needs and solved problems with minimal guidance. Watching Robert create a perfectly aligned section of thatch, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction that transcended pride in a student's progress. It was the satisfaction of knowing his craft would continue, that the knowledge passed to him by his father and others would extend beyond his own lifetime. The morning of the Midsummer Festival dawned clear and warm, the village cautiously embracing the opportunity for communal celebration after months of tension. The newly thatched alehouse stood ready, its fresh golden roof catching the early light. Tables were arranged on the village green. Food preparations began in multiple cottages, and children were released from their usual chores to gather wildflowers for decorations. Thomas spent the morning making final inspections of his recent work, ensuring everything was secure before allowing himself to participate in the festivities. Eleanor had baked special bread for the occasion, and Robert had carved small wooden tokens, miniature thatching tools, as gifts for the children, an acknowledgement of his acceptance into the community. As the celebration began, with music from simple instruments and the first cups of ale being poured, Thomas found a moment of quiet reflection. Standing slightly apart from the gathering, he looked across the village he had helped shelter throughout his lifetime. Every thatched roof represented hours of his labor, each one unique yet connected to the others in a visual harmony that defined rural medieval aesthetics. Father Michael approached, offering Thomas a cup of wine, a luxury reserved for special occasions. "Your work endures," the priest observed, following Thomas's gaze across the thatched landscape. Stone crumbles, wood rots, but well-laid thatch, renewed with care, can protect generation after generation. It was perhaps the most eloquent description of a thatcher's contribution Thomas had ever heard, acknowledging both the temporary nature of the material and the permanence of the knowledge tradition. As the day progressed and the celebration continued, Thomas observed Robert moving comfortably among the villagers, no longer an outsider, but a community member with a valued role. The continuity represented by this apprenticeship, the passing of knowledge, the preservation of craft, the maintenance of shelter, stood as a counterpoint to the uncertainty of the wider world with its threats of illness and change. When evening approached and the first stars appeared above the thatched roofs of Willowbrook, Thomas found himself filled with a quiet contentment. The long silence of medieval roof thatchers was not silence at all, but rather a language spoken through straw, and skill through protection offered and knowledge preserved, through communities sheltered across centuries of wind and weather. It was a conversation carried out in golden stems and careful bindings, in techniques refined and passed forward, in the rustle of fresh thatch and the soft patter of rain on roofs that would stand long after their makers had gone. As this chapter closes its eyes, another tale begins to stir, where hands that once wove protection from straw now reach across time, brushing against memories as ancient as the rhythms of hearth and home. Beneath time's gentle veil, straw weavers once climbed wooden ladders to touch the sky. Their calloused hands spoke languages lost to modern ears, fingers dancing with reed and sedge, combing centuries into shelter. Their stories linger in ancient beams, whispering secrets only the patient moon still remembers. In the small hamlet of Fernwick, nestled within the rolling countryside of medieval England, the morning mist unfurled like a dreamer's sigh across the meadows. The year was 1328, though few villagers tracked time with such precision. They measured their days by the height of the sun, the songs of birds, and the cycle of seasons that painted the landscape in ever-changing hues. It was early autumn now, that gentle transition when summer's warmth still lingered in the afternoon light. But morning brought the first whispers of the cooler days to come. Thomas Fletcher had risen before dawn, as was his custom. At 45, winters, he was considered an elder among the village thatchers, a master of a craft passed down through countless generations. His weathered hands bore testimony to decades spent gathering, preparing, and weaving the materials that sheltered his community from rain and wind and snow. Those hands moved with unconscious precision as he prepared a simple breakfast of barley bread and ale, his mind already drifting to the day's work ahead. His cottage stood at the edge of the village, its own roof a testament to his skill. The thatching rose in perfect symmetry above the timber walls, the ridgeline decorated with intricate cross patterns that served both function and beauty. Smoke curled lazily from the central hearth through the smoke hole in the thatch, dispersing into the pearly morning light. Thomas ate unhurriedly, savoring the quiet solitude before the village stirred to life. The morning ritual had become precious to him after the passing of his wife some 5 years prior. Agnes had been his companion for 20 summers, and though the sharpest edges of grief had softened with time, her absence remained a gentle ache that accompanied his days. Their son William had moved to the next village upon marrying, returning occasionally with his growing family. Their daughter Catherine had married the miller's son and lived just down the lane, blessing Thomas with the laughter of grandchildren that drifted through his windows on warm afternoons. As he finished his meal, Thomas gathered his tools with methodical care. His thatching kit was simple, yet precisely maintained. Wooden mallets of various sizes, long needles crafted from animal bone, specialized knives with curved blades for trimming, and his prized legget, a flat wooden tool with notched teeth, used to dress and smooth the thatch. Each implement had been crafted by his own hand or inherited from his father before him, each bearing the patina of generations of use. Today's work would take him to the farmstead of Harold the shepherd, whose barn had suffered damage during the summer storms. It wasn't a complete rethatching, just a repair to a section that had begun to leak. But Thomas approached every task with the same devotion, whether grand or humble. The craft demanded nothing less. He stepped outside, drawing a deep breath of the cool morning air. The village was beginning to stir now. Smoke rose from other cottages, and he could hear the distant lowing of cattle being led to pasture. Thomas nodded respectfully to the elderly weaver who lived in the neighboring cottage, and she returned the gesture with a gentle smile. Few words were exchanged. Their mutual respect had been established through decades of shared village life, and morning greetings needed no elaboration. Thomas followed the well-worn path that wound through the village. The ground beneath his feet was still damp with dew, and birdsong filled the air with nature's own gentle symphony. He passed the village church, its stone walls already ancient when Thomas's grandfather had been a boy. Its roof was thatched as well, a point of pride for the village Thatchers who had maintained it through generations. Thomas remembered helping his father with that very roof as a young apprentice, learning the specialized techniques required for the steeper pitch and more complex structure. Beyond the church, the path narrowed slightly as it led through a small grove of oak trees. Thomas paused here, as he often did, to gather his thoughts. The oaks were ancient guardians, silent witnesses to countless human stories that had unfolded beneath their spreading branches. They had stood when Norman lords first claimed these lands, and would likely stand long after Thomas himself had returned to the earth. There was comfort in that continuity, in being part of something that stretched beyond the brief span of a single human life. Harold's farmstead came into view as Thomas emerged from the grove. Several outbuildings surrounded the modest manor house, all with carefully maintained thatch. The damaged barn stood to the west, and Thomas could see from a distance where the recent storms had lifted a section of the roof. Not a severe problem, yet, but one that would worsen with the coming winter rains if left untended. Harold himself emerged from the house as Thomas approached, wiping his hands on his tunic. A stocky man with a full beard, now more grey than brown. The shepherd had a reputation for fairness and hard work. "God give you good day, Thomas," Harold called, raising a hand in greeting. "And to you, Harold," Thomas replied with a respectful nod. "I've come to see to your barn." "You're a blessing," Harold said, falling into step beside the Thatcher as they walked toward the damaged building. "The last storm took us by surprise. I feared it might be too late in the season to find help. Better to mend it now than face greater troubles come winter," Thomas observed quietly. "I've brought my tools. Do you have materials laid by, or shall I use what I've stored?" "I've some reeds saved from last season's cutting," Harold said. "My sons gathered it from the riverside. It's been drying in the small shed." Thomas nodded, approvingly. Proper materials were essential to good thatching, and Harold had always been prudent enough to maintain a store for repairs. The two men walked in companionable silence to inspect the damaged section more closely. The barn was substantial, large enough to store winter feed for Harold's extensive flock and provide shelter during lambing season. Thomas studied the roof with a practiced eye. The damage was localized to an area perhaps 6 feet across, where wind had found purchase beneath the thatch and lifted it. Water had seeped in afterward, but thankfully the underlying timbers showed no signs of rot. "A straightforward repair," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "I'll need your ladder, if you please." While Harold went to fetch the ladder, Thomas examined the stored reed in the small shed. It was of good quality, harvested at the right time and properly dried to prevent mold or decay. The material had a pleasant, earthy scent that reminded Thomas of countless projects through the decades. There was something deeply satisfying about working with materials drawn directly from the land around them, a connection to place and tradition that rooted the craft in something deeper than mere utility. With the ladder positioned securely against the eaves, Thomas ascended with the careful movements of one long, accustomed to working at heights. His feet found the wooden rungs with practiced ease, one hand steadying his body while the other carried a bundle of tools. Age might have slowed him slightly, but his movements retained the fluid economy of a master craftsman. The damaged section came into clearer view as he reached the roofline. Thomas set his tools down on the solid thatch beside the damaged area and took a moment to analyze the problem from this new vantage point. The barn roof was nearly 15 years old. He remembered thatching it when Harold had first expanded his flock, but had been well maintained and remained sound apart from this recent damage. Thomas began by carefully removing the compromised material, setting it aside to be composted later. His fingers worked methodically, detecting subtle differences in texture and resistance that told him where healthy thatch ended and damaged material began. Clouds drifted lazily overhead as he worked, occasionally filtering the autumn sunlight and casting gentle shadows across the golden landscape. Harold's youngest son, a boy of perhaps 9 summers, came to watch the thatcher work. He stood silently at first, observing with the solemn curiosity of childhood. Thomas acknowledged him with a nod, but continued his work without interruption. "Master Thomas," the boy finally ventured, "how do you know where to place each bundle?" Thomas smiled slightly, remembering his own boyhood questions to his father. "The reed tells you where it wishes to lie," he answered, his voice soft, but carrying clearly to the attentive child. "Each piece has its place, just as each person has their purpose in the village." The boy considered this with serious eyes. "Could I learn to hear what the reed is saying?" "In time," Thomas replied, selecting a fresh bundle and beginning the process of securing it to the roof structure. "The learning is in the hands as much as the ears. Watch now. See how the new thatch must overlap the old, like stories passed from grandfather to father to son." The child settled cross-legged in the yard below, content to observe the methodical progress of the repair. Thomas worked steadily, his movements unhurried yet efficient. Each bundle of reed was laid with precise care, secured with flexible hazel, spars that would hold it firmly in place through winter storms and summer heat. The repetitive nature of the work created its own peaceful rhythm, a meditation of sorts that had soothed Thomas's spirit through decades of life's joys and sorrows. By midday, the repair was taking clear shape. Harold's wife appeared with a wooden bowl of pottage, a thick stew of seasonal vegetables, barley, and small pieces of salted pork, along with a chunk of bread and a cup of small beer. Thomas descended the ladder to accept this hospitality, with thanks, settling in the shade of a nearby apple tree to enjoy the simple meal. The boy had remained, joined now by his older brother. They kept a respectful distance but watched with undisguised interest as Thomas ate. The Thatcher had always been a figure of quiet fascination in the village, a keeper of an ancient craft that transformed simple materials into protection for all. "Is it true," the older boy asked hesitantly, "that you can predict the weather by how the thatch speaks to you?" Thomas smiled into his cup. Village stories often attributed mysterious powers to craftspeople of all kinds. The blacksmith, who could speak to metal, the potter who could feel tomorrow's weather in his clay. The thatch creaks and whispers different songs before rain or snow, he acknowledged. But that's not magic, just the way of natural things when you've listened long enough. The boys exchanged glances, clearly hoping for tales of more mysterious powers, but Thomas offered no further elaboration. The craft itself was wonder enough without embellishment, a wisdom passed through thousands of hands across centuries, adapting to each region's materials and weather patterns, yet remaining essentially unchanged in its fundamentals. When he had finished his meal, Thomas thanked Harold's wife and returned to his work. The afternoon passed in the same gentle rhythm as the morning. The sun arced gradually westward, casting longer shadows across the farmyard. Village life continued its timeless patterns around him, chickens scratching in the dust, women calling. To children, the distant sound of the smith's hammer providing a counterpoint to the softer sounds of nature. As the repair neared completion, Thomas began the final dressing of the thatch. This was perhaps the most satisfying part of the work, using the legget to comb and smooth the surface until it would shed water effortlessly. The tool made a soft, whispering sound as it passed through the reed, almost like the hushed voice of the material itself responding to the thatcher's touch. Thomas worked with particular care along the edges where new thatch met old, ensuring a seamless transition that would prevent future water ingress. The sun was low on the horizon when Thomas finally descended the ladder for the last time. Harold's eyes emerged from the house to inspect the work, nodding with appreciation as he circled the building. "Fine work as always, Thomas," he said, running weathered fingers along the edge of the repair. "One cannot even see where the damage was." "It will serve you well," Thomas replied simply. "The reed was of good quality. Keep a watch after the next heavy rain, but I doubt you'll find any leaking." They settled the matter of payment without haggling, a portion of wool from the next shearing, some cheese from Harold's wife, and a small amount of silver. Such arrangements were common in village life, a complex web of exchanges that bound the community together through mutual obligation and respect. Thomas gathered his tools as twilight began to soften the landscape. The boys had remained throughout the afternoon, occasionally asking questions or helping to hand up bundles of reed. As Thomas prepared to leave, The younger one approached with solemn purpose. "Will you teach me some day, Master Thomas?" he asked, his voice carrying the earnest hope of childhood. "To hear what the reed says." Thomas studied the child thoughtfully. Few young people showed interest in the thatching craft these days. Many were drawn to trades that might take them to larger towns, or to the relative security of working the land for more prosperous farmers. "If your father permits it, and if you still wish it when you're a bit older," Thomas replied, "you may come and learn what I can teach." The boy's face brightened, and he dashed away to share this news with his brother. Thomas exchanged a few final words with Harold, then began the walk back to the village as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The return journey gave Thomas time for reflection, a quiet accounting of the day's work that had become another ritual in his ordered life. Each project, no matter how small, represented a continuation of something larger than himself. He thought of his own apprenticeship to his father, and his father's to his grandfather before him. How many generations had passed these same skills along, hand to hand, through uncounted centuries? The village appeared ahead, cottages now dark silhouettes against the twilight sky. Smoke from evening cook fires created a gentle haze in the cooling air, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke and humble suppers. Candles and rushlights glowed in windows, creating islands of warmth in the gathering darkness. Thomas paused at the edge of the village, as he often did, to simply observe this moment of transition from day to night. The thatched roofs of the cottages formed undulating lines against the darkening sky, each one a testament to the collective knowledge of centuries, each one sheltering lives being lived in their own quiet fullness. His daughter Catherine was waiting at his cottage door with a covered pot, a stew she had prepared for him. This too was part of the rhythm of village life. The small kindnesses exchanged, the looking after one another that formed the true foundation of their community. "You've had a long day, Father," she said, taking his tool bundle as he approached. "I've brought your supper, and news of the children if you're not too tired to hear it." Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine pleasure. "I'm never too tired for that," he assured her, holding the door so she could enter. Ahead of him, the interior of the cottage welcomed them with familiar shadows. Thomas lit a rushlight from the banked embers of the morning fire, and its gentle glow illuminated the simple space, the table and bench he had crafted himself, the sleeping alcove with its straw-filled mattress, the shelves holding humble crockery, and the few books he had acquired through his life. Catherine busied herself heating the stew over the rekindled fire, while Thomas washed the day's dust from his hands and face in a basin of cool water. This evening ritual, the quiet domesticity shared between father and daughter, had become a comforting constant in both their lives. Age had not diminished his strength substantially, but it had taught him the wisdom of measured effort rather than hasty exertion. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Thomas reached the outskirts of the village. Children were being called in from their play, and the scents of evening meals being prepared drifted on the cooling air. Thomas guided his cart toward the drying shed attached to his workshop, a simple structure with open sides to allow air circulation, but a carefully thatched roof to protect materials from rain. The process of unloading and properly arranging the day's harvest would take another hour or more. Each bundle needed to be positioned to ensure optimal drying, with space for air to circulate freely. Thomas worked, methodically, his hands automatically testing each bundle's positioning, making small adjustments until satisfied. The village priest passed by as Thomas was completing this work, pausing to observe for a moment. "A good harvest, Thomas?" "God has provided well this year, Father," Thomas replied, straightening to greet the older man properly. "The materials are sound," the priest nodded, leaning slightly on his walking staff. "Your work on the church roof has kept us dry through many storms. A blessing on your hands." It was a simple exchange, but it carried the weight of mutual respect, acknowledgement of how each man's role contributed to the village's well-being. When the priest continued on his way, Thomas returned to his final adjustments of the drying materials, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest at the day's accomplishment. With the last bundle properly positioned, Thomas closed the workshop for the evening and made his way to his cottage. Unlike the previous night, no one awaited him with a prepared meal, but this too was part of the rhythm of his life. He kindled his fire with practiced ease and prepared a simple pottage of dried beans and preserved vegetables, food that would sustain his body after a day of physical labor. As Thomas ate his modest supper, he mentally reviewed the materials he had gathered and those he still needed before winter's arrival. There would be more harvesting days in the coming weeks. Sedge from different areas of the wetland, perhaps some wheat straw, if the farmers had any to spare after threshing. The continuous cycle of gathering, preparing, and crafting formed the backbone of the Thatchers' year, less visible than the act of creating a roof itself, but equally essential to the final result. Evening settled fully around the cottage, and Thomas lit a single rushlight that cast a warm glow through the simple space. He took up a length of twine and began the meditative process of creating new binding cords for future thatching work. Twisted to precise tension, coiled for storage, their deceptive strength crucial for securing materials against winter winds. His fingers worked without conscious direction, the knowledge residing in muscle memory developed through decades of repetition. Outside, the night deepened around the village. Dogs barked occasionally in the distance, and once the sound of a traveling cart passed along the main road. Thomas worked in peaceful solitude, aware of his place within the larger community, yet content with this quiet evening of preparation for work yet to come. When the binding cords were finished, and his eyes began to feel the day's tiredness, Thomas banked the fire for the night and prepared for sleep. Through the small window, he could see stars appearing in the clear autumn sky, countless pinpoints of light that had guided travelers and inspired wonder throughout human history. As sleep approached, Thomas's thoughts drifted to the young boy who had watched him work at Harold's farm, the child who wanted to learn to hear what the reed was saying. Perhaps there was hope that the ancient craft would continue for another generation, that the knowledge carried in his hands might find new vessels to carry it forward. It was a comforting thought to accompany the transition into dreams. The gentle rhythm of village life continued around Thomas in the days that followed. His work took him to various structures requiring minor repairs before winter, a loose section here, a weathered area there. Each small intervention potentially prevented greater damage during the coming months of rain and snow, though few would notice these quiet acts of maintenance and care. Twice more, he returned to the wetlands for specific materials, and once he traveled to a neighboring village to exchange some of his harvest for a different type of reed that grew better in their soil. These connections between communities were ancient, practical networks of mutual support that had evolved over centuries of rural life. On Sunday, as promised, Thomas visited Catherine's home for the midday meal. His grandchildren greeted him with unrestrained enthusiasm, little Mary proudly displaying the gap in her smile, young Thomas eager to show the completed whistle and demonstrate its piercing call. The simple house was filled with the chaos and joy of family life, a counterpoint to the solitude of Thomas's daily existence. Catherine's husband, John, the miller's son, was a serious young man who nevertheless showed genuine respect for his father-in-law's craft. Over the meal, more elaborate than Thomas's usual fare, with fresh bread, roasted chicken, and seasonal vegetables, they discussed the condition of various roofs in the village. "The tavern will need attention before long," John observed. "I noticed water stains on the ceiling beams when I was there yesterday." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. 5 years since it was last done. The western exposure wears faster there, with the prevailing winds. He made a mental note to speak with the tavern keeper soon. Better to address such issues before winter's full arrival. The conversation drifted to other village matters. A forthcoming marriage between two young people, rumors of a traveling merchant expected in the coming month, concerns about a sheep illness reported from farms to the north. Thomas listened more than he spoke, appreciating this window into the fuller social fabric of the community. After the meal, Thomas sat by the hearth with his grandchildren. From his pocket, he produced a small carved wooden bird that he had prepared as a gift for Mary to commemorate her lost tooth. The child's eyes widened with delight as she accepted the simple treasure, turning it over in her small hands to admire every detail. "It's a swallow," Thomas explained gently. "They build their nests under the eaves of our roofs. Neighbors who share our shelter. Does it have a name?" Mary asked seriously. "That's for you to decide," Thomas replied with a smile. "A name is a precious gift to give." For young Thomas, he had brought a small pouch containing different samples of thatching materials: reed, sedge, rye straw, each with distinctive characteristics. The boy examined them with earnest curiosity as his grandfather explained the properties and uses of each. "The knowing is in the hands," Thomas told him, guiding the child's fingers to feel the subtle differences between the materials. "Eyes can be fooled sometimes, but the hands remember." It was a simple afternoon of family connection. Nothing remarkable by outward appearance, yet rich with the quiet transmission of knowledge and affection across generations. When Thomas finally took his leave, as afternoon light began to soften toward evening, he carried with him the renewed awareness of his place in the continuing story of his family and community. The following week brought the first truly cold morning of the season. A crystalline dawn where frost sparkled on every surface and breath formed visible clouds in the still air. Thomas rose in darkness, feeling the familiar twinge in his joints that winter always brought. He built up the fire, warming his hands before beginning the day's preparations. Today would take him to the tavern to assess the issue John had mentioned. Thomas dressed in layers, knowing that the coming chill would deepen before the day was through. The walk to the village centre was quiet. Few were about at this early hour except those with essential tasks. The frost crunched pleasantly beneath Thomas's feet, and the world had that particular hushed quality that comes with the first real cold. He nodded to the baker, already at work beside his ovens, and to two labourers heading out to the fields. Tavern was just beginning to stir when Thomas arrived. The keeper, a broad-shouldered man named Walter with a perpetually ruddy complexion, was sweeping the floor and banking the hearth fire for the day ahead. "Thomas," he greeted with genuine warmth. "Early for ale, even for a man of your years." Thomas smiled slightly at the familiar teasing. "I hear your roof might be speaking to you in ways it shouldn't," he replied, setting his tool bundle down beside the door. Walter's expression grew more serious. "Aye, the last heavy rain showed through in the corner there." He gestured toward the western end of the room. "Not a deluge, mind you, but enough to worry about what winter might bring." Thomas nodded and moved to examine the area indicated. The ceiling beams did indeed show darkened areas where moisture had penetrated. Not severe damage yet, but a clear warning of potential problems. "I should look from above," he said simply. Walter led the way to the narrow staircase that accessed the upper floor and, from there, a hatch that opened onto the roof itself. The morning air bit more sharply at this height, and the frost on the thatch glittered in the early light. Thomas moved carefully across the roof, his experienced feet finding secure placement despite the slippery surface. The problem area was evident to his trained eye. A section where years of weather had compressed the thatch and created a slight depression where water could pool. The underlying material had begun to deteriorate, allowing moisture to penetrate to the structure beneath. "It's not a full re-thatching yet," Thomas called down to Walter, who stood watching from below. "But more than a simple repair. The western section needs renewal." They discussed the scope of the work, materials needed, and fair compensation. Such negotiations were straightforward between men who had known each other for decades and understood the value of both skilled labor and the community's gathering place. They settled on work to begin the following week, weather permitting, with payment to be a combination of coin, ale, and meals during the project. Business concluded, Walter insisted Thomas come inside for a morning cup of ale and a crust of fresh bread. The tavern keeper's personal breakfast that he was glad to share. They sat near the hearth as the tavern gradually came to life around them, exchanging news and observations about village affairs. "Young Robert's talking of leaving for the town," Walter mentioned, his tone suggesting he found this development unfortunate. "Says there's more future in carpentry there than here." Thomas considered this information thoughtfully. Robert was a talented young man who had shown considerable skill with wood. His departure would be a loss to the village. "The towns draw many now," he observed quietly. "The promise of coins instead of goods exchanged, of new ways instead of old." "And is that promise kept, do you think?" Walter asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "For some," Thomas replied simply. "Not for all. But young hearts must follow their own path, even if it leads away from what we know." The conversation continued in this philosophical vein for a time. Two older men contemplating the changes they had witnessed through decades of village life. Neither expressed judgment on these changes, merely acknowledgement of the inevitable flow and shift of human circumstance. When Thomas finally rose to leave, The tavern had begun to fill with its morning visitors, those seeking company as much as ale, those conducting informal business, those simply taking a moment's respite before the day's labor continued. It was another form of community shelter, Thomas reflected. Not against rain or snow, but against isolation and the hardships of rural life. His work on the physical roof contributed to the continuation of this less tangible but equally vital protection. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of preparation for the tavern repair. Thomas visited his drying shed each day to select and prepare the materials that would be needed, binding some into secure bundles, trimming others to precise lengths, soaking the most brittle in water to restore flexibility. Each step was performed with the unhurried precision that characterized all his work. Actions refined through thousands of repetitions until they approached perfection. On the fourth day, as Thomas was preparing hazel spars for the project, he received an unexpected visitor. Harold's younger son, the boy who had watched the barn repair with such fascination, appeared at the workshop entrance, standing hesitantly as if unsure of his welcome. "Good day, young Edwin," Thomas greeted him, remembering the child's name from conversations with Harold. "What brings you to my door?" "Father said I might come," the boy replied, his voice carrying the careful formality children often adopt when addressing elders outside their family. "If you are not too busy with important work." Thomas gestured for the child to enter. "No work is too important for a visitor who comes with purpose," he said. "And what is your purpose today?" Edwin moved closer, his eyes taking in the various materials and tools arranged throughout the workshop. "You said when I was older, I might learn to hear what the reed says," he reminded Thomas seriously. "I've had another birthday since then." The declaration brought a rare full smile to Thomas's weathered face. The child couldn't be more than 10 summers old, hardly the age when apprenticeships typically began, but his earnestness deserved respect. "Indeed you have," Thomas acknowledged. "And with birthdays comes readiness for new knowledge." He considered for a moment, then selected a small bundle of reed from his workbench. "Here, hold this, and tell me what you notice about it." Edwin accepted the bundle with solemn care, his small hands exploring the material with genuine curiosity. "It feels smooth in one direction but rough in the other," he observed after a moment. "Good," Thomas nodded approvingly. "And why might that matter when placing it on a roof?" The boy's forehead furrowed in concentration. "So the rain knows which way to go?" "Precisely," Thomas confirmed, pleased with the intuitive response. "The reed guides the water downward, away from the house. Every piece must lie in the same direction, like fish swimming in a stream." For the next hour, Thomas guided Edwin through simple observations about different thatching materials, their weight, flexibility, durability, and appropriate uses. The boy absorbed each lesson with remarkable focus for his age, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest rather than merely polite attention. When it came time for Edwin to return home for the midday meal, Thomas gave him a small bundle of reed to take with him. "Practice feeling the direction," he instructed. "Learn to know it without looking. The hands must understand before they can create." The boy departed with evident delight at this first small step toward learning the craft. Thomas watched him go with mixed emotions, pleasure at finding such unexpected interest in the ancient skills, uncertainty about whether such knowledge would serve the child well in a world that increasingly valued different kinds of work. The pattern established that day continued through the changing seasons. Edwin appeared at Thomas's workshop once or twice each week, gradually taking on small tasks that built his understanding of the Thatchers' craft. Thomas found himself adapting his solitary routines to include these teaching moments, explaining processes he had performed automatically for decades, articulating knowledge that had long resided in his hands rather than his words. The tavern roof repair was completed before the first winter storms arrived, a project that drew some attention from the village as Thomas worked above their gathering place. Several people stopped to watch for a time, offering comments or questions that Thomas answered with his customary quiet patience. Edwin observed whenever his other duties allowed, sometimes handing up tools or materials under Thomas's careful direction. Winter settled fully upon the village in due course, a season of shortened days and indoor work. Thomas used this time for meticulous tool maintenance, for planning the coming year's larger projects, and for the careful preparation of specialized materials like the decorative hazel rods used for ridge patterns. Edwin continued his visits, despite the cold, learning to identify different types of damage that winter could inflict on thatched roofs and how each should be addressed when spring allowed repairs. Thomas found, somewhat to his surprise, that these teaching sessions brought a new dimension to his solitary craft. Articulating his knowledge required him to examine practices he had long taken for granted, sometimes leading to fresh insights about techniques he had used for decades. The boy's questions occasionally illuminated connections or possibilities that Thomas himself had not fully considered, despite his years of experience. As winter gave way to the first tentative warmth of early spring, Thomas began including Edwin in more practical aspects of the work. The boy's hands were still small and lacked the strength for many tasks, but they were dexterous and increasingly confident with the basic techniques of binding and layering. His enthusiasm never wavered, even when assigned repetitive, preparatory tasks that tested patience more than skill. Harold observed his son's growing involvement with quiet approval. "He speaks of little else these days," he told Thomas one evening when they encountered each other outside the tavern. "Reed and sedge and proper angles. His mother fears he'll end up dreaming of thatch instead of more profitable trades." "There are worse dreams to have," Thomas replied simply. "The craft has fed and sheltered me all my life." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Times change though. More slate coming even to villages now. More brick." "Indeed," Thomas acknowledged. "Yet good thatch has virtues those materials lack. Warmth in winter, coolness in summer. And it comes from our own lands, not distant quarries." The conversation was not a debate, merely two fathers, one by blood, one increasingly by craft, considering a child's future prospects. Neither presumed to know with certainty what the coming years might bring, either to the ancient craft or to the boy who showed such affinity for it. Spring advanced into full glory, bringing with it the year's cycle of renewal and repair. Thomas found himself busier than in previous years, partly due to genuine need for his skills, partly because news of Edwin's informal apprenticeship had reminded villagers of the value in maintaining their traditional roofs properly. The boy accompanied Thomas whenever his family could spare him, gradually taking on more complex aspects of the work under careful supervision. By midsummer, Edwin had developed sufficient skill to complete simple repairs independently, though Thomas always checked his work afterward. The child's hands, though still small, had begun to develop the specialized calluses that marked a Thatcher's touch, physical evidence of knowledge being literally embodied through practice. On a particularly fine day in late summer, the kind of day when the quality of light seems to transform ordinary landscapes into scenes of remarkable beauty, Thomas took Edwin to the wetlands for his first formal lesson in selecting and harvesting materials. They set out early, walking side by side along the familiar path, the boy carrying a smaller version of the tools Thomas had used for decades. "Before we take anything from the land," Thomas said as they approached the reed beds, "we must observe what it offers. Look at how the different plants grow. Which ones reach highest? Which ones bend easily? Which ones stand straight against the wind?" Edwin nodded seriously, his eyes taking in the varied textures and forms of the wetland vegetation. Thomas guided him through the careful process of selection, how to identify the strongest growth, how to cut in ways that would promote future health, how to handle the harvested materials to preserve their essential qualities. They worked together through the morning, the boy's movements gradually becoming more assured under Thomas's gentle guidance. By midday, Edwin had harvested his first proper bundle of thatching reed, not a large quantity, but material he had selected and cut entirely through his own developing judgment. As they sat sharing a simple meal in the dappled shade at the wetland's edge, Edwin looked up at his mentor with earnest eyes. "Master Thomas," he asked, "do you think I could be a real thatcher someday, like you?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, watching a dragonfly hover above the reed tips nearby. "You have the hands for it," he said finally, "and the heart to listen to what the materials tell you. Those are the things that cannot be taught." He paused briefly. "The world may change around the craft, Edwin. It already does. But shelter will always be needed, and good work will always find value with those wise enough to recognize it." The boy nodded, seemingly satisfied with this measured assessment. They finished their meal in companionable silence before returning to their careful harvest, the ancient wetland embracing them both, master and student, elder and child, in the timeless rhythm of taking from the land with respect, transforming with skill, and creating shelter that would endure through seasons yet to come. As summer gave way to another autumn, the cyclic nature of the Thatchers' work began a new revolution. Thomas observed the changing light with practiced awareness, noting how it cast different shadows across the roofs he had created and maintained throughout the village. Each passing season wrote its story on these humble structures, gradually altering their appearance, yet leaving their essential function intact, much like the quiet passage of time across his own weathered features. Let us now drift gently into the next forgotten story as the whispered craft of one generation passes softly into the hands of another. Through the mist of centuries, watchful fingers weave golden straw into sheltering crowns, their artistry born of earth and sky. Time-honored knowledge passed in whispers between generations. These forgotten artisans shaped the silhouette of medieval villages with patient devotion and weathered palms. The village of Elmsworth lay nestled in a shallow valley where morning mist gathered like dreams between thatched rooftops. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, light spilled across the dew-kissed landscape, turning each droplet into a tiny prism that caught and scattered the nascent day. It was early summer in the year 1328, and the world was stirring with the gentle rhythm that had defined rural life for centuries uncounted. Thomas Reeve had risen before the sun, as was his custom. At 58 winters, his body was a testament to decades of climbing and bending, of carrying bundles and binding reeds. His hands, large and weathered like oak bark, could still detect the perfect dryness of straw without looking, could still twist and secure a length of twine with the dexterity of a much younger man. He moved through the dim interior of his modest cottage, taking care not to wake his wife Margaret, whose soft breathing punctuated the morning stillness. Outside, the village was beginning its slow awakening. A cockerel crowed from a nearby croft, and the soft lowing of cattle carried from the common grazing land beyond the village boundary. Thomas breathed deeply, taking in the fragrance of earth and grass, of wood smoke, and the sweet scent of the linden trees that lined the path. To the church, above him, his own roof, a masterwork of carefully layered wheat straw, protected his home, just as the roofs he created sheltered others. Thomas was a thatcher, as his father had been before him, and his grandfather before that. The knowledge of his craft flowed through his veins like inherited memory, passed down through generations until it became inseparable from his very being. Each family in the village possessed such inherited wisdom. The miller, the blacksmith, the cooper, the baker, all keepers of ancient knowledge that sustained the community through seasons of plenty and times of hardship. In the cool morning air, Thomas gathered his tools, the thatcher's knife with its curved blade worn thin from countless sharpenings, the wooden mallet polished by decades of use, the yew-wood needle for stitching the bundles, the legget for driving the straw into neat alignments, and his ladder, crafted from ash wood, light enough to carry yet strong enough to bear his weight as he worked along the eaves and ridges of rooftops. Today, he would begin work on the widow Chapman's cottage at the edge of the village. Her roof had weathered many seasons since Thomas's father had thatched it 30 years before. During the last heavy rains of spring, water had begun to find its way through the aged straw, forming a slow drip that threatened the widow's few possessions. Thomas had promised to see to it before the summer storms arrived. As he walked through the village, his tools slung over his shoulder, he greeted the few early risers. A shepherd boy driving his flock to pasture, the baker already covered in a fine dusting of flour, the parish priest making his way to morning prayers. Each acknowledged him with a respectful nod. A thatcher's work was essential to the community, providing protection against rain and snow, heat and cold. A well-thatched roof could last a generation or more, and Thomas's work was known throughout the region for its durability and craftsmanship. The widow Chapman's cottage stood on a gentle slope overlooking a small stream. Apple trees, their branches, heavy with unripe fruit, provided dappled shade in the yard. The old woman herself was waiting by the door, her thin frame wrapped in a woolen shawl, despite the promise of warmth in the day ahead. "God give you good day, Master Reeve," she called as he approached. Her voice carried the gentle quaver of advanced age, yet remained clear as stream water over stone. "And to you, Goodwife Chapman," Thomas replied with a respectful inclination of his head. "I've come to see about your roof, as promised." The widow smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "You're a man of your word, just like your father. Before you, I've prepared some bread and cheese for your midday meal. You'll find it wrapped in the pantry when hunger finds you." Thomas thanked her and set about his assessment. First, he would need to examine the roof from inside to understand where the water was finding entry. Then he would remove the old thatch, layer by layer, salvaging what he could and determining how much new straw would be required. It was meticulous work that demanded patience and care. The interior of the cottage was dim and fragrant with the scent of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Thomas climbed the narrow stairs to the loft and carefully examined the underside of the roof. Here and there, daylight penetrated through the thatch where the straw had thinned or been damaged by birds or the relentless work of time and weather. He noted each area of concern, building a map in his mind of the repairs needed. Back outside, he positioned his ladder against the eaves and climbed with the practiced ease of countless ascents. The old thatch beneath his hands told its own story, of rain and snow, of winter winds and summer heat, of smoke rising from the hearth below to seep through the straw and depart into the open sky. Every roof had its own tale, written in the patterns of wear and the marks of the elements. As the sun rose higher, Thomas began the careful work of removing the damaged sections of thatch. He worked methodically, starting at the ridge and moving downward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The old straw, fragile after decades of service, crumbled between his fingers in some places. In others, it remained surprisingly resilient, a testament to the quality of the original work and the materials chosen by his father long ago. By midday, Thomas had cleared a significant section of the roof. Sweat dampened his shirt and rolled down his weathered face, but he took satisfaction in the progress made. He descended the ladder and found the shade of an apple tree where he unwrapped the bread and cheese left by the widow. The bread was hearty and dark, the cheese sharp with age. He washed both down with cool water from the stream, savoring the simple pleasure of a meal earned through honest labor. As he ate, a young boy of perhaps 10 summers approached cautiously, watching Thomas with undisguised curiosity. "You're the Thatcher," the boy said, not a question but a statement of recognition. "I am," Thomas confirmed. "And who might you be?" "William." "My father is John the carpenter." The boy edged closer. "How do you know where to put the straw so the rain doesn't come through?" Thomas smiled. It was the question of a thoughtful mind, one that sought understanding rather than mere knowledge. "Would you like to see?" The boy nodded eagerly, and Thomas beckoned him closer. Taking a few stalks of the old thatch, he demonstrated how they must be layered, always ensuring that water would be directed outward and downward, never inward. "You see, William, water always seeks the lowest point. Our task is to guide it along the path we choose, not the path it might make for itself. Every piece of straw becomes part of a whole, each supporting the others, each doing its part to turn aside the rain." The boy watched intently as Thomas's gnarled fingers arranged and rearranged the straw, creating miniature patterns of protection. Could I learn to do that someday? There's always need for those who work with care and patience, Thomas replied. If your father has no objection, you might come and watch sometime. The learning begins with watching, you know. My father always said that the eyes must learn before the hands can follow. William's face brightened at the suggestion, and he promised to seek his father's permission. Thomas watched him run off, seeing in the boy's enthusiasm an echo of his own childhood fascination with the craft that would become his life's work. After his meal, Thomas returned to his labour. The afternoon stretched before him, golden and warm as the ripening wheat in the fields beyond the village. He would not finish the roof today, or even tomorrow. Proper thatching could not be rushed. Each bundle of straw must be prepared with care, each layer secured firmly to withstand years of weather. As he worked, Thomas's mind drifted through memories of roofs he had thatched over the decades, the grand hall of the local lord with its complex valleys and ridges, the humble cottages of villagers like himself, the church whose steep pitch had challenged even his father's skill. Each roof was a record of time and place, of the materials available and the knowledge applied. Long after the thatcher was gone, his work remained, sheltering generations yet unborn. The rhythmic nature of the work allowed Thomas's thoughts to wander, while his hands moved with practiced precision. He thought of his eldest son, now a thatcher in his own right, working in a village a day's journey away. He thought of his younger son, who had chosen to follow the plough rather than the thatcher's ladder, finding his calling in the turning of soil rather than the layering of straw. And he thought of his daughter, married to a merchant in the nearby town, her hands now busy with fabrics and accounts rather than the materials of the countryside. Each had found their own way, as it should be, yet Thomas took quiet pride in knowing that the knowledge he carried would not perish with him. It lived on in his eldest, would be passed to grandchildren perhaps, ensuring that the ancient craft continued its journey through time. As the afternoon waned, shadows lengthened across the widow's yard. Thomas secured his work for the day, carefully, covering exposed sections to protect against overnight dew or unexpected rain. He would return with the dawn to continue. The widow appeared from her cottage, bent but dignified, to inspect his progress. "It will be sound again," Thomas assured her, pointing out the areas he had cleared and explaining his plan for the days ahead. "By Midsummer's Day, your roof will turn water as surely as a duck's back." The old woman nodded, satisfaction evident in her faded eyes. "My husband would be pleased. He always said that a thatcher holds the sky at bay with nothing more than straw and skill." "Wise words," Thomas acknowledged, "though I would add patience to that recipe." As he gathered his tools for the journey home, the evening air grew cool around him. Birds called their day's end songs from the trees, and the distant sound of the village church bell marked the hour of vespers. Thomas felt the pleasant ache of physical labor in his shoulders and back, the honest fatigue that came from work. Well done. The path home took him past fields where other villagers were concluding their day's labors. The shared rhythm of rural life bound them together. The rising and setting of the sun, the turning of seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, of birth and death and renewal. Thomas greeted each fellow traveler with a word or gesture of recognition, each connection reaffirming the web of community that sustained them all. At his own cottage, smoke rose from the chimney in a thin vertical column that spoke of still evening air. Inside, Margaret had prepared a simple supper of pottage, a thick soup of vegetables and barley, seasoned with herbs from her garden. The familiar scents welcomed Thomas home, as did the sight of his wife's face, lined by years but softened by the firelight. "How fares the widow's roof?" she asked as he washed his hands in the basin by the door. "It will need more new straw than I first thought," Thomas replied, settling onto the bench at their table. "But there's good material still sound beneath, the damaged layers. Old Edward knew his craft well." Margaret nodded, remembering Thomas's father, gone these 15 years but still present in his work throughout the village. "Will you finish before the moon is full?" "With fair weather, yes. Young Peter has promised to bring the new straw tomorrow." Peter was the son of a local farmer who specialized in growing the long-stemmed wheat variety preferred by Thatchers. The relationship between Thatcher and straw grower was another thread in the tapestry of interdependence that defined village life. As they ate their simple meal, Thomas and Margaret exchanged the small news of the day: who had been seen at the Yi market, whose cow had calved, which fields were showing the best growth. After supper, Thomas sat by the hearth and used the last of the daylight to repair one of his tools, a wooden yoke that had developed a crack. His fingers, so dexterous in their specialized work, moved with practiced ease as he bound the split wood with strips of soaked rawhide that would shrink and tighten as they dried. Night fell fully, and the cottage grew dim except for the firelight. The day's exertions made Thomas's eyelids heavy, and soon he and Margaret sought their bed, falling into the deep sleep of those whose bodies have labored honestly and whose minds are untroubled by artifice or excess. Dawn came again, as it always had and always would. Thomas rose with the first light, his body stiff from yesterday's work, but ready for the day ahead. The morning routine repeated: the gathering of tools, the quiet departure, the walk through the awakening village. Such was the eternal cycle that governed the lives of those who worked with their hands, whose labor was dictated by daylight and seasons rather than the artificial measurements of merchants and nobles. At the widow's cottage, Thomas found Peter waiting with a cart loaded with bundles of golden straw. The young farmer's face showed pride in his crop, and rightly so. The straw was perfect. Long, straight stalks with minimal seed heads, harvested at precisely the right moment and dried to ideal condition. "You've done well, Peter," Thomas acknowledged, examining a handful of the material. "Your father taught you properly." The young man smiled at the praise. "He says the secret is in the soil preparation before planting and harvesting before the stalks become too brittle." "Wisdom there," Thomas agreed. "Help me unload, and I'll show you how we prepare the bundles for thatching." Together, they transferred the straw from cart to yard, stacking it neatly under the apple trees, where it would remain dry yet accessible. Thomas then demonstrated how to sort and grade the straw, selecting the longest and straightest pieces for the visible outer layer, using the shorter or slightly bent stalks for the underlayers, where appearance mattered less than function. Peter watched attentively, asking questions that revealed his curiosity about the craft that depended on his farming skills. Thomas answered each query with patience, remembering his own youthful desire to understand the connections between his work and the larger world it served. When the cart was empty and the straw properly stacked, Peter departed with Thomas's thanks and payment, a combination of copper coins and a promise of help when Peter's own cottage needed repair. Such exchanges, part currency and part barter, formed the economic foundation of village life, a system based on recognized value and mutual trust. Thomas returned to the roof, continuing the careful removal of damaged thatch. By midday, he had cleared the entire affected area and could begin the process of renewal. First, he repaired the wooden battens, the horizontal supports to which the thatch would be secured. Several had rotted over the decades and needed replacement. From his bag of materials, Thomas produced new oak battens, cut and shaped the previous, evening after supper. With the foundation made sound, he could now begin applying the new thatch. This was the heart of his craft, the process that transformed simple straw into a living, breathing shelter. Thomas prepared the first bundle, aligning the stalks and binding them with twine into a compact form called a yelm. Each yelm must be of consistent thickness and density, ensuring uniform coverage as the roof took shape. Working from the eaves upward, Thomas positioned the first layer of new straw. With practiced movements, he secured each bundle to the battens, using carefully split hazel spars, thin, flexible lengths of wood that could be bent without breaking. These spars, driven through the straw and around the batten beneath, would hold the thatch in place for decades. The widow Chapman emerged, occasionally, to watch his progress, offering a cup of cider or a word of appreciation before returning to her own tasks within the cottage. Other villagers passed by, some pausing to exchange greetings or observe the thatcher's work. Each interaction reminded Thomas of his place in the community, not merely a craftsman providing a service, but a keeper of essential knowledge, a protector against the elements. As the new thatch took shape, covering the exposed timbers with its golden mantle, Thomas felt the deep satisfaction that came from renewal, from extending the life of a dwelling that had sheltered generations. There was a profound rightness in the work, a connection to cycles larger than any single human life. The afternoon passed in steady labor. Thomas's movements were unhurried, yet efficient, each motion refined by thousands of repetitions across the decades. When the sun began to lower in the western sky, he had completed perhaps a third of the necessary work. It was enough for one day. Tomorrow would bring continued progress, and the day after that would see completion. As Thomas descended his ladder for the final time that day, he noticed young William watching from a respectful distance. The boy had returned, drawn by fascination with the ancient craft. "My father says I may watch if I don't disturb your work," William said, his voice carrying both excitement and hesitation. Thomas nodded, pleased by the boy's interest. "Tomorrow, come earlier. If you're willing to learn, there are small tasks you might help with." The boy's face brightened with anticipation. "I'll be here before the cockerel crows a third time," he promised earnestly. That evening, as Thomas walked home through the golden light of approaching sunset, he reflected on the day's accomplishments and the unexpected appearance of young William. Perhaps here was another thread of continuity, another possibility for the transmission of knowledge that had flowed unbroken through countless generations of rural craftsmen. The following morning arrived with a gentle mist that burned away as the sun climbed higher. True to his word, William was waiting when Thomas arrived at the widow's cottage. The boy had clearly taken pains with his appearance, his face scrubbed clean, and his simple clothing as neat as humble materials would allow. "Good morning, Master Reeve," he greeted Thomas with formal respect. "Good morning, William," Thomas replied, suppressing a smile at the boy's earnest demeanor. "Are your hands ready for honest work today?" "Yes, sir. My father says all worthy skills begin with willing hands." "Your father speaks truth," Thomas acknowledged. "Come then, you can help me. Prepare the straw." Throughout the morning, Thomas guided the boy through simple tasks, sorting straw by length, helping to align stalks for bundling, fetching tools as needed. William applied himself with diligence, his young face serious with concentration. Thomas worked beside him, demonstrating each technique with careful explanations, answering the boy's many questions with patience. "Why must the straw all face the same direction?" William asked as they prepared another bundle. "So that water flows downward along the stalks," Thomas explained. "If they point in different directions, rain might find its way inward rather than running off as it should." He demonstrated the principle by pouring a small amount of water from his flask onto a properly aligned bundle, showing how it traveled downward without penetrating. The boy nodded with understanding. "Like the feathers on a duck." "Precisely so. Nature offers many lessons for those who build and craft." As midday approached, Thomas allowed William to climb the ladder under close supervision, to experience the perspective of the roof and understand how each layer of thatch related to those above and below it. The boy's eyes widened as he gazed across the village from this unaccustomed height, seeing familiar surroundings from a new angle. From here, all the roofs looked like a golden sea, William observed, taking in the vista of thatched cottages and outbuildings that spread across the landscape. "And like the sea, they rise and fall with the passing of time," Thomas replied. "Every roof has its season, its beginning and ending. The thatcher's work is to honor that cycle while extending it as long as craft and materials allow." The philosophical nature of the observation seemed not lost on the boy, who nodded thoughtfully before carefully descending the ladder. Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun, the pleasure of sharing hard-won wisdom with receptive youth, of seeing understanding dawn in young eyes. The remainder of the day passed in steady progress. William stayed until mid-afternoon, when his mother required his help with other chores. He departed reluctantly, but with Thomas's invitation to return on the morrow. "You've found an apprentice, it seems," observed the widow Chapman as she brought Thomas a cooling drink of small beer. "Perhaps," Thomas allowed. "Time will tell if his interest persists beyond novelty. The craft demands more than momentary fascination. The same could be said of life itself," the old woman remarked with the quiet wisdom of her years. Thomas worked until evening, completing another substantial section of the roof. The new thatch gleamed golden in the slanting light, contrasting with the darker, weathered portions that remained to be replaced. The transition between old and new created a visual record of time's passage, a testament to the cyclical nature of human dwelling places. The third day of work followed the pattern established by its predecessors. William returned, eager to continue his informal education. Thomas assigned him progressively more complex tasks, measuring the boy's capability and commitment. By midday, William was confidently preparing straw bundles with minimal supervision, his small hands quickly adapting to the techniques Thomas demonstrated. "My father says that woodworking and thatching are cousins," the boy commented as they worked side by side. "Both protect and shelter using what grows from the earth." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Your father has the right of it. We harness what the land provides, transforming it through knowledge and skill to serve human needs. But we must always remember that we borrow these materials from the earth. We do not truly own them." The boy considered this concept, his young brow furrowed in thought. "Is that why you thank the straw sometimes when you think no one is looking?" Thomas paused, surprised by the observation. It was true that he often murmured words of acknowledgement to the materials he worked with, a habit learned from his father, who had learned it from his own. It was not something he spoke of commonly. "You notice much for one so young," Thomas said finally. "Yes, I thank the straw, and the trees that provide our battens, and the earth that nurtures them all, not because they can hear me, but because the gratitude reminds me that my craft is part of something larger than myself." William absorbed this explanation without the dismissal or mockery an adult might have offered. The openness of youth allowed him to consider ideas that more worldly minds might reject as simple superstition. By late afternoon of the third day, the roof was nearly complete. Only the ridge, the uppermost section where the two roof planes met, remained to be finished. This was the most visible part of any thatched roof, and often the most decorative. Different regions, and even individual thatchers, had their own distinctive ridge styles, identifying marks as surely as a potter's seal or a blacksmith's touch mark. Thomas selected the finest straw for the ridge work, the longest and most golden stalks. With William watching attentively, he demonstrated how to create the rolled ridge that was traditional in their region, a neat cylindrical form that would cap the roof like a crown, providing both practical protection and visual harmony. "This is where the thatcher signs his work," Thomas explained as his fingers deftly manipulated the straw into the desired shape. "Though we leave no name, those with knowledge can look at a ridge and know who created it, as surely as if we had carved our mark in stone." William watched with fascination as the ridge took form, secured with complex stitching that was both functional and decorative. By the time the shadow of the church tower stretched across the village green, the work was complete. Thomas and the boy descended the ladder for the final time and stepped back to view the finished roof in its entirety. The transformation was profound. What had been a deteriorating shelter, compromised by weather and time, now stood renewed, a perfect golden crown that would protect the widow's dwelling for another generation. The fresh thatch caught the late afternoon light, seeming to glow from within. "It's beautiful," William breathed, honest admiration in his voice. "Beauty that serves," Thomas corrected gently. "Remember always that true craft finds the meeting place between usefulness and grace. Neither alone is sufficient." The widow Chapman emerged from her cottage, gazing up at her renewed roof with undisguised pleasure. "God has blessed your hands, Master Reeve," she said softly. "My home is secure, Again, Thomas accepted the compliment with a humble inclination of his head. May it shelter you in comfort for many years to come, good wife Chapman. As Thomas gathered his tools for the final time, the satisfaction of completion settled over him like a familiar cloak. This was the rhythm of his life, the assessment, the clearing away, the renewal, the completion. Each roof was a verse in the ongoing song of community, of shelter and protection against the elements that had challenged human ingenuity since the first dwellings were raised against the sky. Other cottagers had wandered by throughout the day, exchanging greetings and news, sometimes pausing to watch the Thatchers at their work. Now, as Thomas and Edwin washed their hands in the bucket Elspeth had provided, neighbours approached with questions about their own roofs. "Master Thomas, the east corner of my dairy shed seems to be thinning," said the miller's wife, her practical eyes evaluating as she spoke. "We'll look tomorrow afternoon," Thomas promised, mentally adding it to the list of tasks that would occupy them during their stay in the village. Elspeth invited them inside as darkness fell, the interior of her cottage warm with firelight. The single room served as kitchen, dining area, and sleeping quarters, with a small loft above where Elspeth's grandchildren sometimes stayed when visiting from the next village. The hearth dominated one wall, its crackling fire the center of household life. Thomas and Edwin sat at the simple wooden table as Elspeth served a humble but hearty stew of vegetables from her garden and a small portion of precious salted pork. The bread they broke together was dense and nourishing, spread with fresh butter from the miller's cow. As they ate, Elspeth shared the village news: births and deaths, a marriage to be celebrated at Michaelmas, the Lord's new taxation demands. Thomas listened more than he spoke, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. Thatchers moved between communities, carrying not just their craft, but also stories and information. They were conduits of news in a world without printed broadsheets or rapid communication. "And what of the wider world?" Elspeth eventually asked, as she always did. "What news from your travels?" Thomas shared what he had gathered, rumours of a new king's proclamation, the price of wool in the market towns, a harsh storm that had damaged crops to the east. In this way, information travelled slowly across the medieval landscape, carried by those whose work took them beyond village boundaries: peddlers, pilgrims, and craftsmen like the Thatchers. When the meal was finished and the wooden bowls scraped clean, Thomas and Edwin retreated to the barn where they would sleep during their stay. The hay-scented darkness enveloped them as they settled onto pallets of clean straw, their bodies aching pleasantly from the day's labor. "Master," Edwin said, quietly as they lay beneath woolen blankets, "how many roofs do you think you've thatched in your lifetime?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering. "I began learning from my father when I was 7 years old, younger than you were when you came to me. That's 43 years of thatching." He paused, calculating in the darkness. "Perhaps 1,000 roofs, counting repairs and new thatchings together. My father did twice that number, working into his 70th year." Edwin absorbed this in silence, contemplating the vastness of a life measured in roofs completed, in protection offered against the elements. "And each one lasts 30 years or more, if properly maintained," Thomas finished. "Some of my Father's work still stands. When I'm gone, yours will remain. That's the way of our craft. We build what outlasts us. This quiet legacy seemed to satisfy them both, and soon their breathing deepened into sleep, matching the peaceful rhythm of the village around them. Dawn arrived with gentle persistence, filtering through the cracks in the barn walls. Thomas woke first, his body accustomed to rising with the light. He moved quietly, allowing Edwin a few more moments of rest as he stepped outside to assess the day. The morning air carried the crisp promise of deepening autumn, the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth rising from the ground. Mist clung to the lower fields, and the village was just beginning to stir. A cow lowing softly, smoke starting to rise from chimneys, a door opening as someone emerged to draw water from the well. Thomas stretched, feeling the familiar tightness in his shoulders loosen. His body bore the marks of his profession, hands permanently curved from decades of grasping tools, skin weathered by constant exposure to the elements, a slight stoop from bending over rooftops. Yet there was strength in him still, the wiry resilience of one whose work demanded physical fortitude every day. Edwin joined him shortly, blinking sleepily in the morning light. They broke their fast with bread and cheese Elspeth had left for them, washing it down with water from the well. Then they gathered their tools and returned to the roof. The second day's work focused on the ridge, the crowning detail of any thatched roof. The ridge was both functional and decorative, serving to protect the most vulnerable part of the thatch while also displaying the thatcher's artistry. Each region had its traditional patterns, distinctive designs that identified the local style. Thomas worked in the pattern of his homeland, a series of cross-diagonal lines that created a geometric precision along the roof's peak. The ridge speaks of who made it, he explained to Edwin as they worked. In the eastern counties, they favor a smoother line. In the west, more elaborate patterns. A skilled eye can tell where a thatcher learned his craft just by looking at his ridge work. Edwin's hands were becoming more confident with the ornamental work, his earlier clumsiness giving way to growing precision. Thomas watched with quiet approval as the young man completed a section that matched his own work seamlessly. "You have the touch now," he commented, the highest praise he offered. Edwin ducked his head, pleased but embarrassed by the recognition. As morning stretched toward noon, other villagers approached with requests. Thomas dispatched Edwin to inspect the miller's wife's dairy shed while he finished Elspeth's ridge. The division of labor marked another milestone in Edwin's apprenticeship, the first independent assessment he had been trusted to make. When Edwin returned, his report was concise and professional. The east corner needs reinforcing before winter. 3 bundles of reed should suffice, with new bindings throughout that section. Thomas nodded, satisfied with both the assessment and how it was delivered. "We'll see to it tomorrow," he decided. "Today, after we finish here, the smith has asked for repairs to his workshop roof." And so their days in Oakenfield unfolded, one roof at a time. They moved through the village methodically, addressing the most urgent repairs first, then attending to maintenance that would prevent future problems. Each evening brought them to a different household for their meal, as village families took turns hosting the Thatchers in accordance with tradition. At the smith's house, they dined with his large family, 5 children ranging from toddling age to adolescence. all crowded around the table in noisy companionship. At the miller's, they enjoyed the luxury of freshly ground flour baked into especially fine bread. The parish priest offered them not just food, but also cups of imported wine, a rare treat that loosened Thomas's usually reserved tongue, leading to stories of his travels as a journeyman thatcher many years before. A week passed in this manner, the rhythm of work and rest, of craftsmanship and community, unfolding as it had for centuries. Thomas kept a mental tally of completed tasks and materials used, of promises fulfilled and new requests added. No written contracts governed their work, only the unspoken understanding that the Thatchers would ensure the village remained protected before winter arrived in earnest. On the 8th day, as they worked on the roof of the village alehouse, a cold rain began to fall. Thomas and Edwin continued as long as safety permitted, then reluctantly descended. The innkeeper welcomed them inside, where other villagers had gathered to escape the worsening weather. The common room was warm and fragrant with the smell of brewing ale and wood smoke. Men and women from across the village sat at long tables, conversing or simply enjoying the shelter. A natural hush fell as the Thatchers entered, followed by greetings and offers of bench space. "Come, Master Thomas," called the village reeve, the elected official who managed communal matters. "Tell us how our roofs stand for the coming winter." Thomas took a seat near the hearth, accepting the mug of ale placed before him. "Most are sound," he reported. "We've repaired the worst damage. 2 more days' work should see all urgent matters addressed." This news was received with satisfaction. In an age when shelter meant survival, the Thatchers' assessment carried significant weight. Conversation resumed around them, and Thomas fell into discussion with the older men about the weather signs, comparing predictions for the coming winter. Edwin found himself drawn into a different conversation with some of the younger villagers, including the blacksmith's daughter, a serious-faced girl whose knowledge of local plants had proven useful in identifying the best cutting sites for reeds. As the afternoon darkened into evening, and the rain continued to drum on the alehouse roof above them, stories began to flow as freely as the ale. An elderly villager, his face deeply lined with age, recounted a tale from his youth about a harsh winter when the snow had risen higher than the cottage doors. "It was the good thatch that saved us," he concluded, nodding respectfully toward Thomas. "Kept the warmth in when nothing else could have." Another shared memories of helping to thatch the great barn on the Lord's estate, describing the dozens of workers required and the weeks of labor. "Not like your careful cottage work," he told Thomas, but impressive in its scale. As the evening deepened, the conversation turned to older stories, legends and folk beliefs that surrounded their craft. Thomas, loosened by ale and the companionable atmosphere, shared a tale told among Thatchers. "It's said," he began, his voice dropping so that others leaned in to hear, "that when a thatcher dies after a lifetime of honest work, his spirit doesn't depart immediately. Instead, it visits every roof he ever thatched, inspecting each one a final time." The villagers exchanged glances, some making small protective gestures against such ghostly visitations. "Not to frighten," Thomas hastened to add, "but to ensure all remains well. Only when satisfied that his work continues to shelter the living does he finally rest." This notion of responsibility extending beyond death resonated in the room. It spoke to the medieval understanding of craft as something more than mere labor, as a calling with moral and spiritual dimensions. The rain eased as night fully descended, and eventually Thomas and Edwin made their way back to their temporary lodgings in the widow's barn. The village settled into darkness around them, the occasional light from a window or a lantern marking human presence in the vast darkness of the medieval countryside. The next morning brought clear skies and a freshness to the air that spoke of the rain's cleansing passage. Thomas and Edwin returned to the alehouse roof, finding the partially completed work undamaged by the downpour, a testament to their careful methods even when interrupted. As they worked, Thomas found himself reflecting on the previous evening's conversations. The story he had shared about Thatchers' spirits was one his father had told him, part of the lore passed down alongside practical skills. He had never questioned whether he truly believed it, but now, as his hands worked automatically at tasks, performed thousands of times before, he wondered. There was comfort in the idea that one's work continued to matter, that the protection offered through craftsmanship represented a kind of immortality. Every roof he had ever thatched stood as a marker of his passage through the world. Some had certainly been replaced by now, but others remained, still sheltering families who might not even know his name. "Master!" Edwin's voice broke into his thoughts. "Is this spacing correct?" Thomas examined the young man's work, nodding approval. "Well done. You're developing the eye for it now." They completed the alehouse roof by midday and moved on to the miller's dairy shed. The work there was straightforward, allowing Thomas to let Edwin take the lead while he observed. By late afternoon, they had addressed that repair as well. "One more day," Thomas announced as they gathered their tools. "Then we move on to Ashford, Magna." Their final day in Oakenfield was devoted to smaller repairs, a patch on the baker's storage shed, reinforcement of the village well's protective roof, attention to a widow's chicken coop. These were modest tasks that might not have warranted a professional thatcher's attention in isolation, but as part of the annual maintenance circuit, they were included in Thomas's informal obligations to the community. As the sun began its descent, on their last day, Thomas and Edwin stood at the village boundary, looking back at the collection of dwellings they had tended. The thatched roofs caught the golden late afternoon light, their contours soft and organic against the autumn sky. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed during their visit. The village looked much as it had upon their arrival. Yet Thomas knew differently. Each repair, each reinforcement, each careful attention to developing weakness had helped ensure these homes would withstand another year of nature's challenges. "We've done good work," he told Edwin, the simple statement carrying the weight of professional satisfaction. That evening, their final one in Oakenfield until the following year, the village held a modest gathering at the Reeves house. It was not exactly a celebration. Medieval life afforded few opportunities for pure festivity outside religious observances, but rather a communal acknowledgement of services rendered and obligations fulfilled. Food was shared, ale was poured, and as darkness gathered outside, the conversation turned to the continuing cycle of agricultural and craft activities that would occupy the village through winter and into spring. The Thatchers' departure marked one milestone in the annual calendar. Others would follow in their appointed times. "Will you pass through at Easter?" asked the reeve's wife, directing her question to Thomas. He shook his head. "Our spring route takes us northward. We won't return until next autumn, when the harvest is in." This was accepted without surprise. The pattern of the Thatchers' migrations was well established, a dependable element in the cycle of medieval life. They would be here when they were needed most, before winter's arrival, just as they always had been. Morning brought their actual departure. Thomas and Edwin packed their remaining materials, the bundles of reed they had not used, the tools of their trade, the few personal possessions they carried on their circuit. Several villagers came to bid them farewell, bringing small food offerings for their journey: bread, cheese, dried apples, and nuts, enough to sustain them until they reached Ashford Magna by nightfall. Elspeth pressed a small cloth bundle into Thomas's hands. "Herbs for tea," she explained, "for when the dampness gets into your bones." He accepted with quiet gratitude, tucking the bundle carefully into his pack. Such gestures of care punctuated the Thatchers' journeys, creating connections that transcended the purely transactional nature of their work. As they walked away from the village, following the rutted track that led eastward through fields being prepared for winter's fallow period, Edwin glanced back one last time. The thatched roofs they had tended were already diminishing with distance, becoming part of the broader landscape of human habitation set against nature's vastness. "I can still identify each one," he remarked, "even from here." Thomas nodded, understanding. "That never changes. Each roof becomes a memory stored in the hands." The road stretched before them, winding through the autumn countryside toward the next village where roofs awaited their attention. Behind them lay the evidence of their labor, silent testimony to skills passed from one generation to the next, across centuries. As they walked, Thomas shared quiet observations about the landscape, where the best reeds grew, how the contours of the land influenced local building styles, which trees provided the strongest supports for thatching. These were not formal lessons, but the casual transmission of accumulated wisdom, the passing on of knowledge that constituted the true education of a medieval craftsman. Edwin listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his growing understanding. 3 years into his apprenticeship, he was developing the observational skills and practical judgment that would eventually allow him to work independently. They reached a stream crossing by midday, pausing there to rest and consume some of the food given them in Oakenfield. As they sat on sun-warmed stones, watching the clear water flow past, Thomas found himself contemplating the nature of their profession. Thatchers existed in a curious space within medieval society. Unlike the blacksmith or the baker, they did not maintain a fixed workshop where clients came to them. Unlike the truly itinerant tinker or peddler, they followed established circuits, returning to the same communities year after year. They were known and yet separate, familiar strangers whose arrival marked the seasons turning. This liminality had always suited Thomas. He valued the moments of community, the shared meals, the exchanges of news, the recognition of his skill, but equally cherished the quiet passages between villages, when it was just the road, the sky, and the rhythms of walking. As they resumed their journey after the brief rest, the afternoon sun warm against their backs, Thomas considered Edwin's future. The young man had the makings of a fine thatcher. Good hands, a keen eye, patience for repetitive tasks, and an understanding of how materials behaved. In another 2 years, he would be ready for his journeyman phase, traveling more widely to learn regional variations in technique before perhaps establishing his own circuit. The continuity pleased Thomas. His father had trained him. He was training Edwin. Edwin would someday train another. The craft passed from hand to hand across time, adapting slightly with each generation, but maintaining its essential nature. They spotted Ashford Magna in the distance as the sun began to lower toward the horizon. The village was larger than Oakenfield, with a small stone church whose square tower rose above the surrounding dwellings. Here too, most buildings wore crowns of thatch, their soft outlines contrasting with the church's angular geometry. "We'll begin with the east side tomorrow," Thomas decided as they approached. "The prevailing wind will have tested those roofs most severely." Edwin nodded, already assessing the visible roof lines with a professional eye. His gaze lingered on one particularly steep pitch. "That one looks newly done, not your work." Thomas studied it, noting the distinctive pattern of the ridge. "Matthew of Dunwood's work, I'd wager. He passes through in early summer. Good craftsmanship, though his binding technique differs from ours." This was not spoken critically. Different, thatching traditions had their own merits. The observations simply acknowledged the individual character that skilled hands left on their work, readable to those who shared the craft. Their arrival in Ashford Magna followed familiar patterns, greetings from villagers who recognized them, arrangements for lodging during their stay, discussions of which roofs needed most urgent attention. The cycle would repeat here as it had in Oakenfield, as it would in every village on their circuit. That evening, as they settled into the hayloft above the village bailiff's stable, Edwin voiced a question that had clearly been forming throughout the day. "Master Thomas," he began hesitantly, "do you ever wish for a fixed abode? A place to call your own, rather than this constant movement?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, considering. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful. "I had such a place once when I was newly married. A small cottage in my home village, with a garden my wife tended. For 7 years, I worked a shorter circuit, returning there between journeys." He had rarely spoken of this period to Edwin before, and the young man listened intently in the darkness. "After the fever took her and our infant son," Thomas continued, quietly, "the cottage felt more hollow than homely. I returned to the fuller circuit my father had travelled, and found comfort in the rhythm of movement, in the changing landscapes, and the constancy of the work itself." He paused, then added, "But that was my path. Many thatchers maintain homes, returning to them between seasons. You will find your own way when the time comes." Edwin absorbed this in silence. Eventually he responded, "I think I would like both. Journeys and returns." "A wise balance," Thomas agreed. "Now sleep. Tomorrow brings new roofs." As Edwin's breathing deepened into slumber, Thomas remained awake a while longer, listening to the night sounds of the unfamiliar stable. Yet there was familiarity in the unfamiliarity, comfort in the consistent routines that framed their work in every village. The medieval Thatcher held no grand position in the social hierarchy, commanded no armies, built no cathedrals. His work required no literacy, featured in no chronicles. Yet it was essential: protection against the elements, insulation against winter's cold and summer's heat, shelter for human lives in all their mundane significance. Thomas thought of all the moments that had unfolded beneath the roofs he had created and maintained. Births and deaths, marriages and partings, everyday meals and rare celebrations, whispered prayers and shouted arguments. The Thatcher enabled these moments of life without witnessing them, creating the protected space within which human experience could unfold. There was profound satisfaction in this knowledge, a quiet pride that required no recognition beyond the evidence of work well done. As sleep finally claimed him, Thomas carried this contentment like a well-worn tool, familiar in his grasp, the understanding that his place in the medieval world, though humble, was necessary and meaningful. And so the seasons turned, each bringing its appointed tasks and rhythms. The Thatchers moved with these cycles, their craft a constant amidst the flow of medieval life. Through spring plantings and summer growth, through autumn harvests and winter stillness, the shaped reeds and straw above village dwellings performed their silent function, channeling rain, resisting wind, insulating against temperature extremes. Thomas and Edwin would continue their circuit until winter's depth made travel impractical. Then, they would settle temporarily in a larger town where Thomas had arrangements with an inn, spending the coldest months repairing tools, teaching Edwin the finer points of decorative work, and occasionally addressing emergency repairs in the immediate vicinity. When spring returned, thawing the paths and awakening the landscape, they would resume their travels, moving from village to village in the ancient pattern of craft and service, of skill offered and shelter maintained. The medieval world would continue its measured pace around them, political powers rising and falling, plagues and prosperities coming and going, while the fundamental rhythms of agricultural life and seasonal work remained largely unchanged. This continuity lay both meaning and comfort, the knowledge that what had been would continue to be, that skills passed down would remain relevant, that the shelter offered through human hands working with nature's materials would endure across generations. The long silence of medieval roof thatchers was not truly silence at all, but rather a different kind of communication, one spoken through materials and techniques, through protection offered and traditions maintained. It was a language of careful hands and weather-watching eyes, of knowledge carried in muscle memory and seasonal migrations. And though few written records would preserve their individual names or document their specific contributions, the evidence of their craft would remain visible across the landscape for decades after their passing, testament to skills that bridged the human need for shelter with the natural world's provision of materials. This was the legacy of Thomas and all who shared his craft, not monuments or inscriptions, but the quiet continuation of life beneath the roofs they created, the invisible inheritance of knowledge passed from master to apprentice, and the enduring patterns of thatched crowns upon humble dwellings throughout the medieval countryside. Thank you for staying with us through this quiet journey through time and craft. If you haven't yet, please subscribe so you don't miss the next gentle escape into history's forgotten corners. May your dreams be as peaceful as the ancient rhythms of the Thatcher's hands. and may you find shelter in stories that connect us to our shared human past.